on the line, an author, writer from militarytimes.com, and that is Tara Copp. Tara, thank you so much for joining us today on WVOX SALRadio.
Sure, thanks for having me.
Thank you. Tara, you wrote an article about the potential repatriation of remains of U.S. military personnel from North Korea, approximately 5,300 MIAs remaining from the Korean War that are thought to have been lost in North Korea. Well, tell us a little bit about some of the findings that you were able to determine about what will happen, the immediate remains that may be available that will be transferred back to America.
Sure. So North Korean officials had previously notified the U.S. that they had what they thought to be 200 sets of remains. And it's not clear whether all 200 of those are going to be transferred into U.S. custody. At some point soon, there'll be a transfer of those remains up at the DMZ, where the U.S. has actually sent 100 wooden transfer cases to collect what is brought to them and to bring them back to Osan Air Base. At Osan, there's going to be DPA officials who will be looking at the remains and processing them for a return flight to the U.S. Now, it's, U.S. officials and the DPA has, when they go look at a crash site, when they're trying to excavate war remains, they have a very arduous process for going to the soil, to looking at effects, to, a really involved, rigorous dig of a site. And it looks like no U.S. officials have actually gone to these sites or been part of the actual bringing of the remains. So it's going to take a while to figure out, who these people are, and then, reunite them with their families if they are indeed former MIA.
Yes, it is arduous. We've followed the work of what used to be called JPAC out at Hickam Air Force Base in Hawaii, and now they renamed to the Defense POW MIA Accounting Agency. And it is a very labor-intensive, detailed process. And there had been some work in North Korea to search for MIA remains up until about 10 years ago, when tensions between the United States and North Korea escalated. Did you get a sense about how many U.S. service personnel remains were able to be identified prior to that change?
They had 33 site visits, but it's not clear how many of those site visits resulted in remains coming home. Just for perspective, the U.S. has just now restarted its program of looking for remains in India. It kicked that off about a year and a half ago. And it took, I think, more than a year and a half's worth of site visits just to bring one particular crew home. It's not a fast process. And the act of verification and then the act of actually transferring, and who knows what sort of regulations North Korea officials had at the time or what they will have in the future to allow future site visits. So if 200 come home in this next transfer, that would be remarkable.
Well, I guess what's a little different in this situation from the search for remains perhaps in Japan or Germany after World War II is that you had POW camps in North Korea that the U.S. has never really had access to, or just the limited access that you described. Is that something, there were talk that there may be cemeteries nearby to those POW camps. We actually tracked two chaplains who died and remain MIAs today, who were believed to die in POW camps in North Korea under very horrendous circumstances, no other way to put it. Is there a sense that there may be a chance to search through what had been prisoner of war camps in the 1950s?
That's the hope. There are concentrations of remains at some of these sites, and if relations remain warmed, which, that's a big if, the hope is that then DPA teams would be able to get to these locations and start to identify how many remains are there and begin to bring those home as well.
Yes, and we're talking what could be fragmentary remains. in many cases, and a very painstaking process. My understanding is that the team at the Defense POW MIA Accounting Command at Hickerson Air Force Base in Hawaii would have to match against family DNA records. Is it a time for families who have an MIA, perhaps from the Korean War, to make sure that they've sent a sample to this agency?
Yes, if they haven't already, it's important to get in touch with DPAA and do DNA so that if there are fragments that come home, with previous excavations, they had a pretty good idea of what crew or who was there because it was U.S. officials on site, using GPS coordinates to say, this is where we are, this was the crash site of, a particular airplane, or this was a prison site. And so they had some confidence as to who they were possibly getting out of the ground. Unless there's been some good record keeping on the North Korean side, and these are all questions we just don't have answers to yet, it's unknown where these remains came from.
Tara, this seems to be a fairly quick development that's happened since the president met with the Korean president. Are the members of the military surprised at the speed with which this is moving?
Everything has happened fast in regards to the Pentagon over the last 15, 18 months or so. It definitely has been a case of the president saying he's going to make something happen, and it quickly evolves. And so the remains question, based on our conversations with Pentagon officials, wasn't even on the radar in the talks leading up to President Trump meeting with the North Korean leader. And then all of a sudden, possibly he read reports. Our own Military Times Leo Shane has been covering this as well extensively and had written before that summit about the need to identify these remains and bring them back. Perhaps that message got to Trump because when he gave his press conference after the summit, kind of mentioned offhand that, oh, by the way, I also decided to just throw this in last minute. So it wasn't something that was probably expected, but it's definitely something that's welcomed by the community here.
Absolutely, for the veterans community, the feeling has always been that the search for MIAs will never stop until there's a full accounting of each and every one of the MIAs from World War II, from Korea, Vietnam, other conflicts, even World War I. There are still hope of identifying remains. Tara, do you get a feel, you wrote in your article in Military Times about the procedures U.S. Officials will take under the direction of General Vincent Brooks, a West Point grad that we've met. What will be the steps once they do receive remains?
So I've had the privilege of watching one of these repatriation ceremonies up close, and they brought a B-24 crew home from India, and it's a really beautiful thing to watch. The transfer cases are, at least in this case, and maybe this will be done slightly differently, but the transfer cases are actually brought out onto the ramp where they begin the formal transition of being repatriated by having, in this case, it would be the United Nations command flag removed and having the coffins redraped with the American flag. That's repatriating them, and then they are solemnly walked onto the C-17, which will fly them to Hawaii.
Sarah Copp, thank you so much for calling in to WVOX and Sons of the American Legion, and really great work on this very, very important story to the entire veterans community.
Thank you for having me.
Okay, thank you, Tara.
And
Bye-bye.
Ken, I